Cottonwood Springs, Colorado Territory, 1872. The West was a harsh mistress that broke men's backs and spirits in equal measure, with little patience for the soft-hearted. Victor Lawson believed this truth more than most as he stared across the barren landscape from atop his paint horse. At 25, he had already witnessed enough brutality to last several lifetimes. "Only fools let down their guard out here," he muttered to his horse, the spring wind carrying his words away. His lean frame sat tall in the saddle, the brim of his well-worn Stetson shading eyes that had grown wary beyond their years. Victor had come to believe that kindness was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford, a dangerous weakness that got good people killed. The son of a failed prospector who died chasing fool's gold, Victor had learned early that sentiment was just another hazard in a land filled with them. He'd spent the last 7 years drifting between cattle outfits, ranch work, and occasional stints guiding eastern hunting parties. He prided himself on needing no one, trusting no one, and keeping his handsome face as impassive as the distant mountains. What Victor wanted was simple, enough money to buy a small ranch somewhere remote, where he could live by his own rules without owing anyone anything. What he needed, though he would never admit it, was something to heal the loneliness that had settled into his bones like the cold mountain air. But loneliness was safer than disappointment, and independence meant survival. He adjusted the revolver at his hip, a Colt 1851 Navy that had seen him through more trouble than he cared to remember, and nudged his horse forward toward Cottonwood Springs. The small settlement had sprung up around a stage stop and trading post, and Victor had hired on with the Rocking K Ranch nearby for the spring roundup. Just passing through, he reminded himself as the settlement came into view. Same as always. The main street of Cottonwood Springs was little more than a muddy track lined with false-fronted buildings. Victor guided his horse toward the general store, planning to purchase supplies before heading to the ranch. He dismounted, tethered his horse to the hitching post, and paused to dust off his denim trousers and straighten his faded blue shirt before stepping onto the wooden walkway. The bell above the door chimed as Victor entered the store, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. The familiar sense of coffee, leather, and tobacco wrapped around him as he scanned the shelves, and that's when he saw her. Standing by a display of fabric bolts, a young woman was examining a length of blue calico. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical yet becoming style, with stray tendrils framing a face that made Victor forget his next breath. She wore a simple dress of forest green that emphasized her slender waist, its practical cut speaking to a life of work rather than leisure. When she looked up at his entrance, her hazel eyes held a directness that was unusual for a woman in these parts. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. Victor nodded curtly, remembering his resolve. Pretty women were as dangerous as rattlesnakes in his experience, more so, because at least with snakes you knew to expect venom. "Miss," he replied, turning toward the counter where the proprietor stood waiting. "Mr. Lawson, heard you were back for the spring roundup," the shopkeeper called. "What can I get for you today?" "Just the usual, Mr. Peterson. Coffee, beans, bacon, ammunition." As the shopkeeper gathered his items, Victor found his attention drawn back to the young woman. She was now speaking with an elderly woman, her manner respectful and attentive. There was something about her that seemed both fragile and resolute, like a wildflower that somehow managed to bloom among rocks. "That'll be Emily Zachary," Peterson said, following Victor's gaze. "Came out last fall to teach at our new schoolhouse. Mighty brave young thing, traveling all that way on her own. Just 22 and already making a difference here." Victor grunted noncommittally, though his interest was piqued despite himself. A schoolteacher out here was unusual enough, but one so young who had traveled alone was rarer still. He was about to turn away when a commotion erupted outside. The sound of angry voices and horses snorting in fear drew everyone's attention to the door. Victor's hand automatically moved to his revolver as he stepped toward the entrance. 3 riders had thundered into town, clearly drunk and looking for trouble. One was firing his pistol into the air while another was attempting to rope a terrified dog that was darting between buildings. "Those are the Harker brothers," Peterson whispered, his face pale. "Mean as snakes when they're sober, worse when they're drinking." Victor watched as the third brother dismounted and staggered toward a water trough where a small boy was filling a bucket. With a cruel laugh, the man kicked the bucket from the child's hands, sending water splashing across the dusty street. The boy's face crumpled, but before tears could fall, Emily Zachary was pushing past Victor and out the door, her green dress fluttering behind her like a banner. "That's enough," her clear voice rang out. "Leave him be, sir." Victor cursed under his breath and followed her outside, certain he was about to witness disaster. The Harker brother turned, surprised at being addressed in such a manner, especially by a woman. "Well now, what have we here? A schoolmarm giving orders." The man's beard couldn't hide his leer as he looked Emily up and down. "Maybe you need a lesson yourself, pretty lady." "The only lesson needed here is in common decency," Emily replied, her chin raised despite the slight tremor in her voice. She placed herself between the man and the boy. "Please go about your business elsewhere, Mr. Harker." The other brothers had noticed the confrontation and were riding closer, their expressions making Victor's blood run cold. Without thinking, he stepped forward, positioning himself beside Emily. "The lady asked you to move along," Victor said quietly, his hand resting on his revolver. "I suggest you do so." The oldest Harker brother squinted at him. "And who might you be, mister?" "Someone who'd prefer not to kill 3 drunks today," Victor replied evenly, "but I will if necessary." There was a tense moment as the brothers assessed the situation. Victor knew his reputation as a steady hand with a gun had spread through these parts. Finally, the oldest Harker spat in the dust. "Come on, boys, ain't worth the trouble today," he glared at Victor. "But we'll remember your face, stranger." "I count on it," Victor replied. As the Harkers rode out of town, Victor became acutely aware of Emily standing beside him, the scent of lavender soap drifting from her hair. He stepped back, uncomfortable with the proximity. "That was foolish," he said bluntly. "Men like that wouldn't think twice about hurting a woman." Emily's eyes flashed. In that child. Should he have faced them alone while adults stood watching? "I would have handled it." "Perhaps, but I won't stand by when someone needs help, Mr. Lawson, Victor Lawson." "Emily Zachary," she extended her hand, which he reluctantly took. Her skin was soft but her grip surprisingly firm. "Thank you for your assistance, though I had the situation well in hand." Victor nearly smiled at her obvious falsehood. "Of course you did, Miss Zachary." The small boy was still standing by the trough, looking up at them with wide eyes. Emily turned to him with a gentle smile. "Are you all right, Thomas?" The boy nodded, then looked at Victor with undisguised admiration. "You scared them off, mister. Are you a gunslinger?" "No," Victor said firmly, "just passing through." Emily's expression clouded slightly at his words, but she quickly masked it. "Well, Mr. Lawson, it seems Cottonwood Springs is fortunate you were passing through today." She turned to the boy. "Come along, Thomas, I'll walk you home." As Victor watched them walk away, the boy chattering excitedly and Emily listening attentively, something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. He quickly suppressed it, reminding himself that attachment was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had seen too many good men die because they were protecting someone they loved, had watched too many women turn bitter from frontier hardships. Yet as he returned to collect his supplies, Victor found himself wondering about the schoolteacher who faced down danger to protect a child, and why, for the first time in years, he felt a crack forming in the wall he had built around himself. The following day dawned clear and cool as Victor rode out to the rocking quay. The ranch foreman, a grizzled veteran named Sam Tucker, greeted him with a nod. "Good to have you back, Lawson. We're short-handed this season." "Lost 2 men to Montana gold fever." Tucker gestured toward the bunkhouse. "Same bunk as last year is yours. We ride out tomorrow at first light." Victor settled in quickly, the routine of ranch life familiar and comforting in its predictability. That evening, as the men gathered around the cookfire, the conversation turned to town gossip. "Heard you had a run-in with the Harker boys," one of the cowhands said, passing Victor a tin cup of coffee. Victor shrugged. "Nothing worth mentioning." "Also heard the schoolteacher was involved," another added with a grin. "Miss Zachary's got every unmarried man in the county thinking about reading lessons." The men laughed, but Tucker silenced them with a look. "Miss Zachary's a respectable woman doing important work. She deserves better than your loose talk." He turned to Victor. "Though I am curious how you got mixed up with her." Wrong place, wrong time, Victor replied, nothing more to it. Tucker studied him thoughtfully. Well, you'll see her again soon enough. Roundup Camp is near her homestead this year. She's got a small place about 5 miles north of town, lives there alone since her aunt passed last winter. Victor frowned, a woman alone out there. She's stubborn as they come, Tucker said. Town offered her lodging, but she insists on keeping her aunt's place going, says she likes the quiet for her books. That night, as Victor lay in his bunk, he found himself thinking about Emily Zachary. A woman living alone on a homestead was unusual and dangerous. The frontier was hard enough on men. For a woman alone, it was nearly impossible. Yet there had been something in her eyes, a determination that suggested she was no stranger to challenges. The next several days passed in a blur of dust, cattle, and exhaustion as the roundup began in earnest. Victor worked from dawn until dusk, finding comfort in the physically demanding labor that left little time for thought. It wasn't until the 4th day, as they moved the herd north, that he caught sight of a small cabin nestled against a stand of cottonwood trees. That's the Zachary place, Tucker confirmed, riding alongside him. We'll be setting up camp about a mile past it tonight. Victor nodded, trying to ignore the inexplicable tension that had settled between his shoulders at the mention of her name. As the men made camp that evening, Tucker approached Victor. Need someone to ride over to check on Miss Zachary. Usually one of us stops by when we're in the area, make sure she's all right. Victor began to refuse, but Tucker continued, would appreciate it being you. You've got a steady head, and after that business with the Harkers, those boys might be looking to cause trouble. Reluctantly, Victor agreed and set out toward the cabin. As he approached, he saw smoke rising from the chimney and a small garden plot to one side. The cabin itself was modest but well-maintained, with curtains in the windows and a neat stack of firewood along one wall. He was about to call out when the door opened and Emily emerged, rifle in hand. She lowered it immediately upon recognizing him. "Mr. Lawson," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "What brings you here?" "Ranch foreman asked me to check on you," he replied, dismounting. "We're camped nearby with the herd." Emily's expression softened slightly. "That's very kind, but as you can see, I'm perfectly fine." Victor glanced around the property, noting the careful maintenance but also the signs of struggle. The garden had suffered animal damage and one corner of the roof showed recent, inexpert repairs. "Been having trouble with your roof?" he asked, nodding toward the patched section. Emily followed his gaze. "A bit. The winter was hard on it, and I'm afraid my carpentry skills aren't what they might be." Victor hesitated, then against his better judgment, offered, "I could take a look at it. Tomorrow, if you'd like." Something flickered in Emily's eyes, pride warring with practicality. Finally, she nodded. "That would be appreciated, Mr. Lawson, though I can only offer a meal in payment." "That's more than fair," he replied, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd eaten a home-cooked meal. As he turned to leave, Emily called after him, "Mr. Lawson, thank you, not just for the roof, but for what you did in town. Thomas hasn't stopped talking about you." Victor felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, which he quickly suppressed with a curt nod before riding away. Later, at camp, he found himself volunteering for the morning watch, knowing it would allow him time to visit Emily's cabin before the day's work began. Tucker raised an eyebrow but made no comment as he adjusted the schedule. Dawn found Victor riding toward the Zachary homestead, tools borrowed from the chuck wagon tied to his saddle. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. As he approached the cabin, he saw Emily already outside, feeding chickens from a basket of grain. She wore a simple blue dress with her hair braided practically down her back, looking for all the world like she belonged in this wild place despite her Eastern manners. She smiled when she saw him, a genuine expression that reached her eyes and made something shift uncomfortably in Victor's chest. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson," she called. "You're an early riser." "Comes with the work," he replied, dismounting and securing his horse. "Thought I'd look at that roof before the day gets too warm." Emily set aside her basket. "I've coffee brewing inside if you'd like some before you start." The cabin's interior was as neat and well-kept as its exterior. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that spoke of a life of learning. A small writing desk sat beneath the window, papers neatly stacked beside an inkwell. The space was modest but somehow reflected Emily's character, practical yet touched by beauty in small details like the wildflowers arranged in a mason jar on the table. "You've made it comfortable," Victor observed, accepting the coffee she offered. "It was my aunt's place," Emily explained, sitting across from him. "She came west after my uncle died, wanted a fresh start. When she wrote that she needed help last year, it seemed a good time for me to make a change as well." Victor detected something beneath her words, a story left untold, and the teaching. The town needed someone. "I had experience from back east," she smiled. "Children are the same everywhere, eager to learn when given the chance. Even out here, where book learning seems less important than survival skills." Emily's expression grew serious. "Perhaps especially here, Mr. Lawson. Education is what will tame this wilderness eventually, not just guns and grit." Her conviction surprised him, as did his interest in hearing more of her thoughts, but the sun was rising higher and he had work to do. The roof repair took longer than expected. Several rafters had rotted and needed replacement, not just the shingles. As Victor worked, Emily brought him water and later emerged with a plate of cornbread and beans for his midday meal. "You're doing far more than I anticipated," she said, watching him work. "I feel I'm taking advantage of your generosity." Victor paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "It needs doing. Can't leave it half finished." "Still, I'm grateful," she hesitated. "May I ask you something, Mr. Lawson?" He nodded cautiously. "You handle yourself like a man familiar with danger, yet you work cattle. There's a story there, I think." Victor turned his attention back to the roof, uncomfortable with her perception. "Nothing worth telling. I go where work takes me." "And where is home?" The question caught him off guard. "Don't have one," he answered truthfully. "Not anymore." Emily was quiet for a moment. "That sounds lonely." "It's simpler," he corrected. "Attachments are dangerous out here. People leave or die, land gets taken. Better to stay free of it all." "Is that truly what you believe, that connection is a liability rather than a strength?" Her question struck too close to the belief he had carried for years. "I've seen what happens to those who think otherwise," he said flatly. "This land doesn't forgive weakness." "I don't believe kindness is weakness, Mr. Lawson." Emily's voice was soft but firm. "Quite the opposite. It takes far more courage to remain open to the world than to close oneself off from it." Victor had no response to this, so he returned to his work, aware that her words had found a crack in his carefully constructed armor. By late afternoon, the roof was repaired. Victor gathered his tools, aware that he had stayed far longer than intended. The roundup crew would have moved on without him, and he would need to ride hard to catch up before nightfall. "I've kept you too long," Emily said, seeming to read his thoughts, "but I'm very grateful for your help." "It was no trouble," he replied, surprised to find he meant it. "Please, come inside before you go. I promised you a proper meal." Victor knew he should refuse, should mount up and ride out immediately. Instead, he found himself following her into the cabin, drawn by something he couldn't name. The meal was simple, rabbit stew with biscuits, but it was the best food Victor had tasted in years. As they ate, Emily told him about her students and her plans for the school. Victor found himself sharing stories of his own, of the places he had seen in his years of wandering, things he rarely spoke of to anyone. "You've seen so much of the West," Emily remarked. "What's the most beautiful place you've found?" Victor considered the question. "There's a valley north of here, in Wyoming territory. In spring, it's filled with wildflowers of every color you can imagine, stretching as far as you can see. Mountains rise up all around it, still capped with snow. When the sun hits them just right, it looks like something from a dream." Emily was watching him intently, a small smile playing at her lips. "You describe it like a poet, Mr. Lawson." Embarrassed, Victor fell silent, suddenly aware of how much he had revealed of himself. He stood abruptly. "I should go, thank you for the meal." Emily walked him to the door. "Will you be in the area long?" "A few more weeks with the roundup, then moving on, most likely." Something like disappointment flickered across her face. "Well, should you find yourself passing by again, you're welcome here, Mr. Lawson." As Victor rode back toward the herd, he found himself unsettled by the afternoon. Emily Zachary had somehow drawn him into conversation, had made him speak of things he usually kept buried. Worse, he had enjoyed it, enjoyed her company, her insights, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her students. "Dangerous thinking," he muttered to his horse as they rode. "She's not for the likes of you." The next week passed in a blur of dust and cattle. The roundup moved farther north, away from Emily's homestead, and Victor told himself the twinge he felt was relief, not regret. He threw himself into work, volunteering for the hardest tasks, staying up for double watches, anything to keep his mind from wandering back to a small cabin and the woman who lived there. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. 10 days after fixing Emily's roof, Victor rode into Cottonwood Springs with several other hands to pick up supplies. As they tethered their horses outside the general store, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A wagon had pulled up in front of the small schoolhouse and several men were unloading lumber. Emily stood nearby, directing their efforts, her face alight with excitement. "What's happening there?" Victor asked Peterson as they collected their supplies. "Miss Zachary got approval for a school addition," the shopkeeper explained, "convinced the town council that growing minds need growing space." He chuckled. "That young woman could talk the spots off a leopard when she puts her mind to it." Victor found himself drifting toward the schoolhouse after completing his errands. Emily was marking measurements on the ground with stakes and string, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up at his approach, her face brightening. "Mr. Lawson. What a pleasant surprise." "Heard you're expanding," he said, nodding toward the lumber pile. "Yes, the town finally agreed we need more space. We've 6 new families with children moving into the area." Her enthusiasm was palpable. "The only trouble is finding someone with the skills to build it properly. Mr. Jensen was going to help, but his wife is ill, and the other men are busy with spring planting." Victor glanced at the lumber, mentally calculating what would be needed. Before he could stop himself, he said, "I could take a look at your plans, might be able to offer some advice." Emily's face lit up. "Would you? That would be wonderful." She led him inside the schoolhouse, where drawings were spread across her desk. As she explained her vision, Victor found himself increasingly engaged in the project, suggesting modifications and improvements based on buildings he had helped construct in his travels. "These are excellent ideas," Emily said, making notes on the plans. "You know far more about construction than you let on, Mr. Lawson." Victor shrugged, picked things up here and there. "Did some carpentry work in Montana a few years back." Emily studied him for a moment. "Would you consider helping with the actual building? The town can pay, of course." Victor knew he should refuse. The roundup would be ending soon, and he had planned to move on as he always did. Yet something, perhaps the hopeful look in Emily's eyes, or perhaps something deeper he wasn't ready to acknowledge, made him nod. "I'll need to speak with Tucker about taking some time, can't promise anything." But Emily's smile told him she understood it was as good as agreed. That evening, when Victor approached Tucker about staying in town for a few weeks to help with the schoolhouse, the foreman studied him with knowing eyes. "Wouldn't have anything to do with a certain schoolteacher, would it?" Victor stiffened. "The town needs the help, I have the skills." Tucker nodded slowly. "Roundup's nearly done anyway, we can spare you." He paused. "Just be careful, Lawson. Miss Zachary's a fine woman, not one for passing fancies." "It's just a building job," Victor replied firmly. But as work on the schoolhouse began the following week, Victor found it increasingly difficult to maintain that fiction. Each day brought new conversations with Emily, new discoveries about her character and her past. She had come west following heartbreak, a fiancé who had chosen another when Emily's father lost his shipping business. She spoke of it matter-of-factly, without bitterness, which impressed Victor more than any display of beauty could have. "It was for the best," she told him as they shared lunch in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "I would never have discovered my love for teaching had I married him, or experienced the West. Sometimes what seems like tragedy is actually opportunity in disguise." Her optimism both confused and attracted Victor. How could someone maintain such hope in a world that had shown its cruelty time and again? As the schoolhouse addition took shape, so did something between them, a connection neither had expected. Victor found himself lingering in town after work, escorting Emily home in the evenings, bringing her wildflowers he found on his morning rides. Emily, for her part, seemed equally drawn to him. She listened intently to his stories, asked thoughtful questions about his experiences, and slowly, day by day, drew him out of the shell he had built around himself. One evening, as they sat on the porch of her cabin watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Emily asked the question Victor had been dreading. "What happens when the schoolhouse is finished, Victor?" He had no answer that wouldn't hurt one or both of them. The truth was, he didn't know anymore. His plans to move on no longer held the same appeal, yet the thought of staying, of allowing himself to care this deeply about someone, terrified him. "I haven't decided," he finally said. Emily nodded, her eyes on the horizon. "You know, when I first came west, I was terrified. Everything was so vast, so untamed. I felt insignificant beneath these skies." She turned to face him. "But I've learned that the very things that make the West dangerous also make it magnificent. You can't have one without the other." "What are you saying?" "That perhaps the same is true of the heart." Her voice was soft but steady. "To love deeply is to risk deeply, but without that risk, we miss the magnificence." Victor looked away, unable to hold her gaze. "Some risks aren't worth taking." "Aren't they?" Emily reached out, her hand covering his. "Is a life without connection truly safer, Victor, or is it just emptier?" Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the stillness. Victor was on his feet immediately, hand moving to his gun as 3 riders appeared in the fading light. "The Harker brothers, well," the oldest called, his voice slurred with whiskey. "Ain't this cozy?" the schoolmarm and her guard dog. Victor positioned himself between Emily and the riders. "You boys are a long way from town." "Free country," the youngest Harker sneered. "Besides, we heard the schoolhouse is looking mighty fine. Thought we'd pay our respects to the teacher." "You can pay your respects in town during school hours," Victor replied evenly. "Now ride on." The middle brother spat tobacco juice into the dust. "You don't give orders here, Drifter. We were born in this territory. You're just passing through." Victor felt Emily stand beside him, her presence both comforting and concerning. He needed to get her inside, away from danger. "Emily," he said quietly, "go into the house." "No," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "This is my home. I won't be chased inside by bullies." The oldest Harker laughed. "Got spirit, don't she? Maybe that's what you like about her, Lawson." His expression hardened. "Too bad you embarrassed us in town. Now we owe you for that." In one fluid motion, the man drew his pistol. Victor shoved Emily aside and drew his own weapon, firing before the Harker brother could get off a shot. The man screamed as the bullet tore through his shoulder, causing him to drop his gun. The other brothers reached for their weapons, but Victor's voice stopped them. "Next one goes between the eyes. Your choice which one of you gets it." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, cursing, the youngest Harker turned his horse. "This ain't over, Lawson. You're dead man." As the brothers rode away, their wounded leader slumped in the saddle. Victor turned to find Emily staring at him with wide eyes. Not fear, he realized with surprise, but concern for him. "Are you all right?" she asked, reaching for him. "Fine," he replied, holstering his weapon with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "But they'll be back with more men. It's not safe for you here." "Where would I go?" "Town. Stay at the boarding house until—" "Until what?" Emily challenged. "Until they forget, until you leave." She shook her head. "This is my home, Victor. I won't be driven from it by men like them." Victor ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "You don't understand. Men like that don't forget. They'll come back when I'm not here, and then—" He couldn't finish the thought. "Then I'll face them," Emily said simply, "as I've faced everything else." No, the word came out harsher than he intended. "I can't let that happen." Emily's expression softened. "Then stay," she whispered. "Not just tonight, but stay." The invitation hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the immediate danger. Victor felt something crack inside him, the wall he had built against attachment, against vulnerability. "Emily, he struggled to find words. "I'm not the kind of man who stays." "I don't know how." "Perhaps it's time to learn," she said, reaching for his hand. "I could help you if you'd let me." Before he could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but devastating in its tenderness. When she pulled away, Victor found himself following, drawing her back into an embrace that spoke more clearly than words ever could. That night, Victor kept watch from Emily's porch, rifle across his knees, thoughts in turmoil. The Harkers would return, of that he had no doubt, but for the first time in years, running away wasn't his instinct. Instead, he found himself planning how to protect what he suddenly, terrifyingly, realized he couldn't bear to lose. Dawn found him still on the porch, decision made. When Emily emerged from the cabin, coffee cups in hand, he accepted one with a nod of thanks. "I need to go into town," he said after a moment. "There are things to arrange." Emily studied his face. "You're not leaving." It wasn't a question, but Victor answered anyway. "No, not yet anyway," he hesitated. "The Harkers have friends, this won't end easily." "Few worthwhile things do," Emily replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. In town, Victor went first to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Davis was a competent man if overworked for the growing settlement. "Heard about the trouble at Miss Zachary's place," Davis said when Victor entered. "Harkers are bad business. Always have been." "They'll be back," Victor said, "with friends." Davis sighed. "I know, but I can't post a deputy out there permanently, Lawson. Haven't got the men." Not asking for that, Victor leaned forward. "I'm staying at the Zachary place for now, but I need to know if trouble comes, you'll ride out." The sheriff studied him thoughtfully. "You sweet on her, Lawson." Victor didn't answer directly. "She's a good woman doing important work. Deserves protection." "That she does," Davis nodded slowly. "All right, I'll keep an ear out, be ready to ride if needed." He paused. "But Lawson, be careful, Harkers play for keeps, and rumor has it they're in with that cattle rustling operation working the North Range." This was new information and troubling. Rustlers meant organized crime, not just drunken troublemakers. Victor thanked the sheriff and continued his errands with a growing sense of unease. At the general store, he purchased supplies, coffee, flour, ammunition, then hesitated before adding a small package of peppermint candies, remembering how Emily had mentioned they were her favorite. Peterson raised an eyebrow at the purchase but made no comment as he wrapped Victor's items. As Victor turned to leave, the shopkeeper called after him. "Those Harkers been asking about you, Lawson, where you're staying, who you ride with. Watch yourself." The warning only confirmed what Victor already knew: a confrontation was coming, and soon. His final stop was the telegraph office, where he sent 2 messages. The first was to a former colleague now working as a lawman in Denver, asking for information on the rustling operation. The second was to his bank in Cheyenne, instructing them to transfer his savings to the Cottonwood Springs Bank. It was the second message that gave him pause. It represented a commitment he hadn't planned to make, not to this town, not to anyone. Yet as he handed over the paper, Victor felt not regret but a strange sense of rightness. That evening, as he rode back to Emily's cabin, Victor found himself noticing details of the landscape he had previously overlooked. The way the setting sun gilded the cottonwoods, how the distant mountains seemed to change color with the fading light, the chorus of birdsong accompanying his journey. It was as though a veil had been lifted, allowing him to truly see the beauty that had always surrounded him. Emily was waiting on the porch, a book in her lap, her face lighting up at his approach. The sight of her, so clearly pleased by his return, stirred something in Victor's chest that was both painful and exquisite. "Any trouble while I was gone?" he asked, dismounting. "None," she replied, "though Mr. Jensen rode by to check on me. News travels fast." Victor nodded unsurprised. "That's good, the more eyes watching the better." As they settled into the evening routine, preparing dinner, sharing the day's events, Victor was struck by how natural it felt. There was a domesticity to their interactions that should have terrified him but instead brought an unfamiliar peace. Later, as they sat before the fire, Victor found himself telling Emily about his past, things he had shared with no one else. About his father's failed dreams and early death, about the years spent drifting, taking whatever work came his way, about the gunfight in Wyoming that had left him with a reputation he never wanted and nightmares that still woke him sweating. Emily listened without judgment, her hand occasionally covering his when his voice faltered. When he finally fell silent, she spoke softly. "Thank you for trusting me with your story." "Never told anyone before," Victor admitted. "Never saw the point." And now, he looked at her, this woman who had somehow breached all his defenses. Now I think maybe there's more to life than just surviving it. Emily's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. There is, Victor, so much more. When he kissed her this time, it was with a hunger born of years of loneliness, of denying himself the very human need for connection. Emily met his passion with her own, her arms winding around his neck, drawing him closer. They broke apart, breathless, foreheads touching. I should go, Victor said reluctantly. Sleep in the barn. Emily shook her head. Stay. Just to sleep, she added quickly, a blush coloring her cheeks. I'd feel safer with you here. That night, holding Emily as she slept against his chest, Victor allowed himself to imagine a future he had never dared consider, one with roots and connections, with a home that wasn't just a place to lay his head but a sanctuary built on love and trust. The dream was shattered 3 days later when riders approached the cabin just after dawn. Victor was already outside, chopping wood, when he spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. He dropped the axe and moved quickly to the cabin door. Emily, he called, riders coming, at least 5 of them. She appeared in the doorway, hair still loose from sleep, eyes wide but determined. The Harkers. Can't tell yet, get dressed quickly. If there's trouble, I want you ready to ride to town. As Emily hurried to dress, Victor checked his weapons and positioned himself on the porch, rifle in hand. As the riders drew closer, he could make out the Harker brothers among them, along with 3 men he didn't recognize. Inside, he told Emily when she reappeared, fully dressed, stay away from the windows. Victor. Please, he said, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. Let me handle this. Reluctantly, Emily retreated inside, though Victor knew she would be watching through the window despite his warning. The riders reined in about 20 yards from the cabin, spreading out in a semicircle, a tactical move that raised Victor's hackles. These weren't just drunken troublemakers, they were positioning themselves for a fight. Morning Lawson, the oldest Harker, called, his arm in a crude sling. Thought we'd pay a social call. You're not welcome here, Victor replied evenly. Ride on. One of the strangers, a lean man with a pockmarked face and cold eyes, spurred his horse forward a few steps. That's not friendly, especially when we've come with a proposition. I'm not interested in anything you're selling. The man smiled, a thin, mirthless expression. You don't even know what it is yet, he gestured around the property. Nice little place the schoolteacher has here. Shame if anything happened to it. Is that a threat? Victor's finger tensed on the rifle's trigger. A fact, this territory's changing. New railroad coming through means new opportunities for men who understand how things work. The man's eyes narrowed. We've got a nice operation going. Cattle, horses, supplies, things have a way of finding new owners when the right people are in charge. You're rustlers, Victor said flatly. The man shrugged. Businessmen, and we're looking to expand. Man with your skills would be valuable. Good pay, regular work. You're asking me to join your gang. Victor didn't bother hiding his disgust. I'm offering you a choice. Join us or, the man let the sentence hang, his meaning clear. Victor's mind raced. These men were more dangerous than he had anticipated, not just local troublemakers but organized criminals with connections. Fighting them alone would be suicide, and even if he won today, they would return in greater numbers. But joining them was unthinkable. Not just because of what it would mean for his own soul, but because of the woman watching from inside, the woman who believed in building things, in education and progress, in the possibility of goodness even in this harsh land. Here's my answer, Victor said, raising his rifle. Get off this property now, or I start shooting. The pockmarked man sighed, disappointing but not unexpected. He glanced at the Harkers. Burn it down, kill him if he interferes. The woman, well, use your judgment. As the men reached for their weapons, a shot rang out, not from Victor's rifle, but from behind the rustlers. They wheeled around to find Sheriff Davis and 6 armed men approaching from the road. That's far enough, Davis called. Drop your weapons and dismount. For a moment it seemed the rustlers might fight, but faced with superior numbers and position, the pockmarked man raised his hands in surrender. The others followed suit, including the Harkers, though they did so with curses and threats. As Davis and his men disarmed and bound the rustlers, Victor remained on the porch, rifle ready, until he was certain the danger had passed. Only then did he lower his weapon, a tremor running through him as reaction set in. Emily burst from the cabin, rushing to his side. "Are you all right?" "Fine," he assured her, though his voice lacked conviction. "How did Davis know to come?" Sheriff Davis approached, having heard the question. "Got a telegraph from Denver yesterday, said you'd asked about the rustling operation and might need backup." He nodded toward the bound men being loaded onto a wagon. "Been trying to catch these boys for months. Your inquiry gave us the connection we needed." Victor nodded, remembering his telegram to his former colleague. "Glad it helped." "More than helped, there's a reward for information leading to their capture," Davis smiled. "Enough to buy a nice piece of land if a man was looking to settle down." The sheriff's meaning wasn't lost on Victor, nor was the way Emily's hand tightened on his arm at the words. After the sheriff and his prisoners departed, promising to return later for statements, Victor and Emily stood in the yard, the morning's events hanging between them like a storm cloud. "You could have been killed," Emily said finally, her voice breaking. "All because of me, because you stayed." Victor turned to her, taking her hands in his. "No, because I chose to. For the first time in years, I made a choice that wasn't about running away or just surviving." He took a deep breath. "I chose you, Emily, and I'd do it again." Tears filled her eyes. "What are you saying, Victor?" "I'm saying I'm tired of passing through life without connecting to it, tired of being alone because I was too afraid to be anything else." He squeezed her hands. "I love you, Emily Zachary. I want to stay not just until the danger passes, but for good, if you'll have me." Emily's smile bloomed through her tears. "I've been waiting for you my whole life, Victor Lawson, even when I didn't know it was you I was waiting for." As they sealed their declaration with a kiss, Victor felt the last of his walls crumble. The West would always be harsh and unforgiving in many ways, but he no longer believed that meant love couldn't flourish here. Emily had shown him otherwise, had shown him that kindness wasn't weakness but the greatest strength of all. 3 months later, Victor stood on the porch of a newly built ranch house, watching as Emily hung curtains in the front window. The house sat on a piece of land not far from her original cabin, land purchased with the reward money from the rustlers' capture. Their wedding the previous month had been a community celebration, with seemingly the entire town turning out to witness their vows. Even Tucker and the boys from the Rocking K had ridden in for the occasion, the foreman serving as Victor's best man. "What do you think?" Emily called, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Too blue." "Perfect," Victor replied, meaning it. Everything about the home they were building together, from the vegetable garden Emily had planted to the corral where Victor was breaking horses for the growing ranch, seemed right in a way nothing in his life ever had before. Emily joined him on the porch, slipping her arm around his waist. "Penny for your thoughts, husband." Victor smiled, still marveling at how natural the words sounded, just thinking about how different everything is from a year ago. "How different I am." "Different how?" He considered the question. "A year ago, I believed the only way to survive out here was to stay detached, to never put down roots. I thought caring about people, about places, was a weakness the frontier would exploit." Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. "And now?" "Now I know better." Victor gazed out at the land that was now theirs, at the future they were building together. "The frontier doesn't break people because they care too much. It breaks them because they try to face it alone." In the distance, a wagon approached, Emily's students coming for the special Saturday lessons she still offered despite her new role as a rancher's wife. She had insisted on continuing to teach, and Victor had supported her decision wholeheartedly, even helping to build a small schoolroom on their property for winter sessions. "They're early," Emily said, straightening her apron. "I should get ready." Victor caught her hand before she could go, drawing her back for a kiss. "I love you, Mrs. Lawson," he murmured against her lips, "more than I ever thought possible." Emily's smile was radiant. "And I love you, Mr. Lawson. Thank you for staying. Thank you for showing me how." As the wagon drew closer, carrying children eager for knowledge and the promise of Emily's famous apple cake afterward, Victor thought about the strange, wonderful path that had led him here. How a chance encounter in a general store had changed the course of his life. How kindness, Emily's kindness, had transformed a lonely drifter into a man with purpose, with connections, with love. The frontier would always demand strength from those who chose to make their lives here, but Victor now understood that true strength came not from isolation but from connection, from building something meaningful with someone who shared your dreams. From finding, against all odds, a love that could not only survive the Wild West but transform it, day by day, into home.